Thank you all for coming to the VIOS seminar. We're happy to have you here. And today we're really excited to have an interesting paper presented by Tomaso Duso and co-authors on Airbnb. Just to remind you that this is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please don't ask any questions and turn off your camera. Otherwise, we ask you to turn on your camera. It makes it a little bit nicer environment. And if you have any clarifying questions, you can go ahead and ask those, turn on your camera and your microphone and do that. However, if they're non-clarifying questions, please wait until Tomaso, he'll have an opportunity, a slide wherever you have an opportunity to answer questions. Otherwise, please keep yourself muted. And again, thank you for joining, and the floor is yours for 45 minutes, Tomaso.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and giving us the opportunity to present this ongoing project. Joined with Klaus Michelsen, who is also at the DIW, Maximilian Schäfer and Kevin Tran, who used to be at the DIW and now are in Bologna and Bristol. I saw them in the audience, so maybe they can also answer some of your questions when they come. So this is a paper about Airbnb. I imagine that most of the people that are here today have been using Airbnb, but I don't know whether everybody has a clear idea of how huge of a success story Airbnb is. So here are just some numbers to remind it. So now there are 5.6 million active listings in over 100,000 cities in more than 200 countries, with more than 800 million guests and 4 million hosts. Right, so Airbnb is double as large as the largest hotel chain, which is Marriott. So in terms of market valuation, right? So Airbnb is huge and is so successful. People love it. So it's clear that this is a platform that brought a lot of benefits to consumers. On the other hand, it also creates substantial concerns in many different dimensions. So clearly the market where Airbnb entered, the hospitality market, had the strongest reactions, right? So their hotels are complaining Airbnb is not competing in a fair way because they are not subject to the same kind of regulation. So it's not the topic of this discussion, but Maximilian and Kevin have a really great paper that I would suggest you to read using data from Paris and a structural model to understand competition between hotel and Airbnb. The other dimension where concern have been raised is the potential negative externalities of Airbnb on the rental markets. And that is what I will talk about today. And then, of course, there are also some other externalities that you regularly read in the newspaper. So people complaining, you know, so there are so many Airbnbs around, and so it's very noisy, there is pollution and so on. So this is not something that we are looking at today. So we focus on the rental market. And there, one sees, looking at the press around the world, that opinions are also very different. So on the one hand, people say, well, don't blame Airbnb for rising rents. So the effect on rents is so tiny. There are other forces that actually are driving rents to increase in many major cities in the world. So some other people say actually it's the opposite. So Airbnb is in some cities, especially a city with a lot of tourists, and in some parts of the city is really a plug, is essentially people stop putting their apartments on the long-term rental market and they short rent it on Airbnb. That is really bad. This triggers regulation. So do you see my mouse? Right. So many cities regulate Airbnb. And the reaction is, well, actually, that is really bad because it reduces the benefits of this fantastic platform that allow the efficient use of the scarce resources, which is space, right? So the discussion is very heated, but the thing that actually brought us to start this project is that everywhere in the world, local government, city councils are regulating Airbnb, right? So in the US, almost 100 cities or counties regulate Airbnb. All major EU cities are regulating Airbnb. And there is a larger heterogeneity in the design of this regulation. Very often you need a permit, but these permits may be different. There are regulations on the length of the days, the type of flat that you can rent or not. There are regulations about taxes. But when we started thinking this project, so we applied for a policy project for the Ministry of Economic Affairs here in Germany. We didn't get the project at the end. So we were really concerned that all these regulations and these decisions, important decisions, were made based on non-existing empirical evidence. Right now, 4 years later, we have much more empirical evidence. But if you see this paper that we quote here, so there are three nice papers looking at the US, showing that actually Airbnb has a positive impact on rents in Boston, in the US. So this has been published last year in Marketing Science. Or Journal of Marketing, maybe. And then there is another paper that is very nice and closely related to what we do for Los Angeles. They also show that actually Airbnb has a significant positive impact on rents and house prices as well. There is one paper for the EU published last year for Barcelona. And these are the paper using an identification strategy. I will tell you something about the identification strategy, and else there are many papers looking at correlations, right? But still the evidence 4 years ago was very scarce, so this evidence is increasing more and more. So on the identification strategy, it's difficult to identify the impact of Airbnb on rents, and the main source of endogeneity is a problem with omitted variable, right? So places that are particularly interesting to live very often are places where rents is high, and these are also places where people want to stay when they rent their Airbnb, right? So there is this positive correlation, right? So a positive correlation between Airbnb and rents may be driven by omitted factors. So one has to think about how to clean up this problem. And so these other guys have used different methods. So the first was on in Nerante, that just used a lot of controls, and then there are two papers, so the Baron paper and the Garcia Lopez paper, that try to use NIV, which is essentially an interaction between Google Trends for the word Airbnb and then the geography, so the distance from local tourist amenities, right? And the nicest one, I think, which is also closest to what we do, is this paper by Koster that uses regression discontinuity design for Los Angeles, where 18 out of 80, I think, counties in the Los Angeles areas implemented some regulation. So they look around the border of counties that implemented a regulation to counties that did not, right? So it's not exactly what we do, but we also use the introduction of the policy. So this is what we do in 2 slides, and then I will stop if you have questions. So the goal is to causally assess the impact of Airbnb on rents and rental market more in general in Berlin. And so we use as an identification strategy the introduction and the change of a short-term rental regulation. And the nice thing, I think, of our design is that these two policies, or the original law and the change, have different effects on Airbnb supply. And I will try to convince you that that is really useful to understand the mechanism. And that is something that the other papers that I quoted didn't do really very much. So we don't only look at the rents, we also look at quantity. So we look at how the presence of Airbnb impacts so the number of flats that are put on major platforms for long-term rents. And then we differentiate among different types of Airbnb with the idea that looking at how many days a apartment is available for booking on Airbnb is a good indicator of whether this the host is a kind of professional host or a occasional host, right? And then we also try, as others have done, to assess the heterogeneity of these effects and show that actually the geography of the city plays also a role, okay? And the byproduct is that, so we also can assess the effectiveness of different regulatory tools. And I think this is particularly relevant because, again, so many cities in the world are using this tool, are updating this tool, so maybe this paper can help to inform this debate, right? So the preview of the results is that the reform, as was expected to substantially reduce the number of entire homes on Airbnb, right? This effect is not a long-term effect, so actually the number of Airbnb is increasing over time, but around the introduction of the law, there was a change that we will use. And we also see that the implementation of the law and the reform of the law have different effects. The implementation of the law had a strong impact on the availability of apartments on Airbnb. And what we find is that one additional year Airbnb increased rent by 6.6 cents per square meter. That seems not to be a lot, but I mean, it's not a very small number. And these increases to 14 cents if we only look at those Airbnb that we think are more the kind of professional Airbnb, right? So having a professional Airbnb nearby increases the rent by 14 cents, knowing that the average rent per square meter in Berlin is around 10 cents. So this is a small, but 10 euros is a small effect, but it's the marginal effect of one Airbnb, right? So, and what we also show is that one additional nearby Airbnb decreases the number of apartments that are up to long-term rentals on these major platforms. So one additional Airbnb decreases the number of apartments rentals apartment by 0.4, and if we look at only the higher availability Airbnb, this is 0.6, and actually we cannot reject the hypothesis that is 1. So, which means so every Airbnb new flat is essentially one less apartment for rent in the long-term market, right? So we see that actually the reform in 2019 had very different effects. So we don't see, so we see a strong decrease in listings, Airbnb, but so what we see is that the higher viability listings are not affected by this reform. which in turns, as a consequence, that the price effect that we observe around this change is much smaller, and we don't observe any effect on the quantities on the apartment set on the rental market. And we also show that there is some heterogeneity within the city. Okay, so now that was very quick. So we still have some time to go into the details, but maybe if you have any question at this point, I'm happy to make a short break. Okay, so if there is no question, so let's go on and explain what we do. So the first thing is I will show off my perfect German knowledge by reading the name of the law, which is Zweckentfremdungsverbotsgesetz. So this law was started in 2013, and it came into effect in 2014. And the law as a goal to ban the misuse of houses for purposes that are not living in these houses. So especially short-term rental, and especially if this is commercial. Right, so the law was really attacking platforms like Airbnb, right? And the law had this initial transition period of 2 years, and essentially it allowed all existing Airbnb to continue to operate for the subsequent 2 years. And at the end of the transition period, or also during the transition period, if new apartment wanted to enter the Airbnb, they should get a permit from the local council. Okay. Then this transition period ended in May 1st, 2016. And there was still quite a lot of uncertainty about the details, who gets a permit, who needs a permit, what is a misuse. But that is the first date that we use, right, as a major policy change. After this date, only Airbnb listing with the permission from the council were permitted. So if you didn't have a permission, so you had to exit the market. There was a substantial fine. It was 50,000 euro, right? So we don't know how seriously this was enforced. I remember at the time that there were discussions that the local authorities in Bezirksämter used a web page where neighbors could write, so my neighbors are renting an Airbnb, so that there was some control, but so this is just anecdotal evidence. Actually, one of the co-authors, Klaus Michelsen, has also good connection with the Berlin Senate, and we tried several times to get access to this kind of information, but it's on the enforcement, but it was not possible. Then there were several moments in time where this law was updated. In April 2018 was the major update, and this major update clarified essentially what a misuse is, right? So the idea was that actually if you have the main residence in that particular apartment, you are allowed to rent out also the entire apartment, surely part of the apartment, and as long as the nature of your main residency is not really changed, right? So, subletting is also okay, and if it's less than 50% of the space in the apartment, right? So The main restriction was for a secondary residence, so somebody who is not living in the apartment, right? Maybe living in another city and owning an apartment. And there it became clear that people having secondary residence cannot rent out this apartment more than 90 days per year, right? Okay. And the maximum fine increased by 10-fold, 500,000 euros. So again, so I'm not sure where this fine was ever imposed, but so it's a big number. Okay. So the permit became a registration number, and the law implied that starting August 1st, this registration number should be displayed by the host. Okay. Again, so we have these two particular dates, and we will look at the implementation of these rules as a kind of quasi-exogenous shock to the Airbnb supply, and we will use these to identify then the effect of Airbnb on the rent market. Okay. So which data do we have? I was mentioning before, so we wrote a policy note in German about this paper, published 3 weeks ago, and it went all over the press, and there was a lot of discussion. Also, policymaker retweeted it, and clearly Airbnb also intervened in this discussion, and so they were complaining that our data is not it's not good. So, and we reacted and say, look, we are very happy if you give us the data. We contacted you 4 years ago, and you didn't even reply. So the data that we have, web scrape data, is data that many other people have been also using. And there are web scrape data both on the Airbnb side and also for the rental market. For the rental market, there is a firm which is called Empirica in Germany that is web scraping the major platforms. So these are the platforms where you can put your apartment for rent or for sale, right? It's Immobilien Scout, Immo Scout, Immonet. I don't remember the third one. So, but this covers the large part of the market. I cannot give you a number, but so it's the majority of apartments are rented through these platforms, right? So they scrape all these platforms. So we essentially have information on the price, the characteristic of each apartment, the exact location for several years. So this is a very nice data set that especially Klaus has been using also for many other papers, right? So then for Airbnb, we use data from inside Airbnb and Tom's Lee. These are also 2 web pages. You can just look there. So they web scrape Airbnb and collect data for many major cities in the world, right? These are essentially monthly snapshot of all available listing with a lot of information about this listing. So the great detail about the data can be asked to Max and Kevin, who have seen the data much more in depth than I did. Then we also collected additional variables about the characteristics of the city, location in the city. So we have point of interest from OpenStreetMap, and then we have data on, say, pollution, noise, and other characteristics that can be downloaded from the City of Berlin webpage, and these data are at a very disaggregated level at the block level. I will show you exactly what a block is. Okay, so we have a very nice data set that entails this geography, so we know exactly where an apartment for rent is, and so So what we do, we try to combine this data in different forms, right? So first of all, we really make use of the address, which means we lose something like 24% of the sample because there is no exact address, or we could not geocode the address perfectly, right? So we still have a sample of say 40,000 apartments, 20,000 around 2016 and 21,000 around 2018. Right, so the sample is slightly selected. So for the apartment for which we have this information, the rent is a bit lower. So these are a bit cheaper apartment and they are a bit smaller. And the reason is that the very nice, large, and expensive apartments, sometimes the agency, they put them on the platform, don't give the address to increase even more the interest of people, so they have to contact them to get the address and so on. So this might have a selection impact on our result, but we think it goes exactly in the opposite direction. So maybe we can come back in the discussion afterwards. So we have two levels of aggregation that we use. So first we look at rents, and when we look at rents, we look at the rent of a specific apartment, right? So that specific apartment in that specific street, number, and floor, right? We can do it because we look at the price, right? So when we look at the quantities, clearly we have to aggregate the data. Sorry, when we look at the price, we look at a rental, so a specific apartment, and we look at Airbnb present in the radius of 250 meters, right? So again, we do some robustness check. This is an area of 0.2 square kilometer, right? So it's not very small. And so when I will show you some statistics, you will see that we still have a lot of Airbnb in 250 meter radius. Okay, so when we go at the rental level, we need quantities. So how many apartments are available? So we need a geography, and we choose the block as a geography. So just to give you an idea, so the block is something that is between some streets. So this is the street where I live, right? So and just to have an idea how it looks like, a block is all this area. So it starts here, right? Come up to here and goes up to there, right? So a block, which is a very typical Berlin unit, right, is based on history. So there are courtyards inside. It means something. So here I counted this morning, they are essentially 10 big houses, right? Okay, in this direction and 10 in the other direction, right? And then they go inside, right? So it's a lot of apartments, okay? And why do we choose the block? Because it's the area, it's a very small area, it's similar in size to the area of the 250 radius, but we also try with a larger geography, right? And we have data at that level of disaggregation. And so what we do is to focus on windows of 6 months around these two reforms, because we want to be sure that we avoid the effect of maybe other major things that happen and that might affect rental markets. Okay? Any question? Everything clear? Okay, so let me show you some graphs and numbers. So as I said, so around 2016, so it's May 1, 2016. So we have 3 months before, 3 months later, right? So in these 6 months, there were almost 20,000 apartments, right? Average cost of the apartment is 9.2 euro per square meter. It's average size 70 square meter, 2.3 rooms. And as you see, so there are around each apartment in 2015 meters, there are 10 Airbnb, right? So this is the average, right? This goes from 0 to over 100. So we have some areas in Berlin where in the area of 250 meters, you have over 100 apartments on Airbnb, right? And we see that out of these almost 10 Airbnb, 3.6 are entire home that are available for booking on Airbnb for more than 180 days, so more than half of the year, right? So this is what we identify, or we think these are the long-term Airbnb users, or what we call the professional users, right? In 2018, so the apartments are more expensive. So in Berlin, rents are skyrocketing. Significantly more expensive. They are significantly smaller, even though not much smaller. And you see what I was mentioning before, notwithstanding this regulation, the number of Airbnbs has increased over time. Right now, you have 13.5 Airbnb in 250 meters, right? But what you also see is that the number of the long-term, so available for more than 180 days, is much smaller, right? Especially in relative terms, right? Okay, so this is Berlin, right? So, and you see that Airbnb is concentrating especially in the central districts, right? So here you should imagine there is the S-Bahn ring. So, and this is the inside of the city, right? So, but there are some sparse Airbnb also outside the city, right? So, and these are our rental data. So here you see the number of rentals per square kilometer, right? So, and we have data on rentals all over the city, but again, so the majority of the rental. So these are apartments put on the platform for long-term rental, okay? So this is just to say that we have a good match. So we have for each regions, both for each of these small units, so we have both Airbnb and rental data. So this is essentially our identification strategy, right? And this is what explains our story. So this figure represents the number of number of Airbnb listing over time, right? So this is all Airbnb. You see there is a trend, so they become more and more over time. So here is our May 1, 2016, and you see there is a sharp drop of Airbnbs, right? It's really a substantial drop of Airbnb listings. It's 25%, more or less, and this is completely driven by the entire home or apartment, right? So you have a small decrease in the number of private room, but the entire home is what is driving this drop, and this is because the regulation is really targeting the entire home and apartment, okay? So this is essentially the kind of, this is our first stage, right? So we will use the dummy for the introduction of this law as a first stage for the number of Airbnb, right? And this is assumed to be exogenous to the unobserved factors that affect prices, right? So you see that in the, what happened in 2018, if you look at this picture, is the same, right? Huge drop in Airbnb listings, completely driven by entire home and apartment, right? So what is different is this. So this is the mean availability, which is the mean number of days per year that a listing on Airbnb is available, right? And you see that, for instance, for shared room, this was in 2015, was almost the entire year, right? Okay, so this is lower for private rooms and entire apartment, And then you have this huge drop coming from around the implementation of the legislation. So if you remember what I said before, so that was one of the main elements in the design of the regulation. So the regulation wanted to limit the number of days that apartments are there for rent, right? So huge drop, again, driven mostly, but not only by entire home and apartment, right? So, and then it's going down and down and down. And you remember what I told you before? So the maximum amount of days that a secondary apartment can be put on Airbnb or on a platform is 90 days. Look at this. This is so this is the average, right? So it's almost 90 days, right? So which means so so the first reform really reduced the availability of Airbnb by 2/3. Availability is the number of days, right? Going from 220 to around 100. And the second reform did nothing. So what happened? So we have the same amount of Airbnb that disappear from the platform, but these are very different Airbnb. In the first reform, we have the Airbnb that disappear from the platform that used to be available for very long. In the second reform, we have actually the same amount of Airbnb exiting the platform, right? But these are those that have low availability. So what we consider to be the occasional host, like you and me, if we go for holiday and we say, you know what, so I put my apartment 1 week on Airbnb, right? So this is fundamentally different because these are two very different kind of user of the platform, different kind of hosts. And you will see that the results that we get are very consistent with this view. How I'm doing with the time? Oh, I have to speed up. Okay, so I don't show you this.
Yeah,
so
you have about 7 minutes.
Yeah, all right. So so the regression that we do is so we want to relate Airbnb on rents or rentals, right? So, and I already told you that we have two different levels of aggregation. Now, as I told you, so Airbnb is endogenous because of metered variable bias, right? So, but also potentially for reverse causality if rents goes up and up and up. So some people might want to list their apartment on Airbnb to gain some money to pay these increasing rents, right? So, so what we do, so we say, okay, we use the introduction and the change of this regulation as an instrument. So this is a source of variation which is exogenous to the rental price, right? But is very relevant because, as I show you, this regulation really reduced significantly the number of Airbnb, right? So, and to do things a bit nicer, so because we have a lot of covariates, so Kevin, you can correct me, I think it's over 300 variables that we can have on the right-hand side, right? So we use a double lasso estimator, single lasso for the OLS and a double lasso for IV, okay? For the rent regression, in the rental regression, we do a simple IV and we have log fixed effects, okay? So main results. So 2016, right? So we see the OLS coefficient is 0.02, which means every entire home in 250, Airbnb entire home in 250 meters increases the rent by 2 cents, right? So this is biased, as we know, as we expected. In the IV is 6 cents, so 3 times as much, right? If we focus on the high available entire home, this effect goes up to 14 cents, okay? So this is the marginal effect of one additional Airbnb into 150 meters, right? So sum it up to 10, which is the average, so it's not a super small effect, okay? So 2018, so this effect is is half as large in the IV, right? And this one, we should not interpret it because the first stage doesn't work. Why doesn't work the first stage? Well, because the reform didn't change the number of high available Airbnb, right? So this coefficient is, so we have very weak instrument, so there is no instrument essentially, and this coefficient is biased, right? So essentially what we are saying is in 2016, large price effect, 2018, very small price effect. So if we look at the number of rentals, right? So here we use entire Airbnb homes per square kilometer because the blocks have different size. And we try to explain the number of apartments that are on rent, long-term rent in that block. And we see that, so one entire home, Airbnb home, decreases the number of apartments by 0.4, right? And it goes up to 0.6 if we only look at the high available, right? And look at the confidence interval, this, we cannot reject one, right? So which means every apartment listed on the Airbnb for more than 180 days is one less apartment in the long-term rental market, right? And in 2018, nothing like this. Why? Well, because we say these are the occasional renters. So these are people who mostly live in the apartment or keep the apartment, but so they do not withdraw this apartment from the long-term rental market, okay? There is heterogeneity in the city, right? So maybe the cumulative effect is how much did the reform actually imply in terms of reduced rent? So in some of the most demanded district, it goes up to 37 euros, yeah, for an average apartment of say 60 square meter, right? It's not huge, but also not super small, okay? So we do several additional robustness tests, placebo, deseasonalized, we use different radius, we use a different treatment month, and results go all in the direction that we would expect. So the conclusion is, so we really try to make, to find a way to causally identify the effect of Airbnb on the rental market using a policy introduction and change as an identification strategy. And we exploit the heterogeneity of this policy to think about the mechanisms that drives these results, right? We find that Airbnb has a statistical and economic impact on rents. It's crowding out long-term rental supply, and this in terms puts a upward pressure on rents, right? And this I think is the most novel part of this paper is completely driven by high availability of what we call professional listing, and low availability occasional listing do not have significant effects. And I think that this is very important, very useful for all policymakers who want to design a regulation that has the aim to reduce the negative externalities that Airbnb can have on rental markets, which we observe they can have, right? And then the target should be really to try to avoid that these professional hosts essentially crowd out long-term rentals from the market. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tomaso. Perfect timing. So right now we'll have a discussion by Milena Almagro, and then we open it up for questions. So I think she's going to load up some slides.
You can see my screen, right? I guess.
Yes, we can see it.
It's on full screen mode now, right?
Yes, it is. That's right.
Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity for discussing this paper, because it's very related to what I do. So it's always a pleasure to learn more about the things that one works on. So as yes, this is working now. So the first thing that I did was to study a little bit the rental market of Berlin. And the rental market of Berlin is a super interesting market. So I invite you, all of you, to read a little bit of the history of it. But one of the things that happened is that in the beginning of the 90s, the government moves from Bonn to Berlin. And this triggers a period of substantial economic expansion. And I'm just going to put some figures that I found from a report of the Deutsche Bank. The unemployment rate went down from 20% in 2003 to 7.5% in 2020. Salaries grew by 37%. Population grew by 1% annually, but housing stock only by 0.5%. And this is going to put all of these ingredients together, is going to put a lot of pressure on the rental market. And what we see as a result of that is that the median price per by square meter almost doubled between 2012 and 2020. And I'm saying all of this partially because it's important to study Airbnb in this context, because if we have a market with a lot of pressure, and if we have Airbnb that is removing the stock away from the long-term rental market, this is going to be extra pressure. But also because what we see is that there is a huge upward trend in the rental price. And this takes me to my following question. What I said is that we see important time trends, and what I'm not so sure about the research design that the authors have is how are we controlling for these time trends. And of course, right now, with the instrument that they are using, they cannot control for that, because if we include, for example, time fixed effects, this is going to be collinear with the instrument, and therefore we're not going to be able to run a first stage, or we're not going to have exogenous variation left in our first stage. However, this is not the end of the wall. I don't think this should be the end of the wall, because something that the co-authors can do, and this is just a suggestion, is to move to a diff and diff design and compare rental prices in nearby cities, nearby municipalities like Potsdam, where these policies didn't happen, and use those houses in nearby municipalities as control. And this is something that has been done recently by this paper, where they evaluate the rent freeze that is going to happen in Berlin for the next 5 years. Now, having said so, as a discussion, I also want to place the paper into the literature. And there are many, many papers about Airbnb. We have reduced form on rents. Some are more causal than others. We have a spatial heterogeneity. We have spillovers to other industries. We have structural work. And what is new here? What is new here is that we want to study what is the effect of different regulations on different types of Airbnbs. And why is this important? Because first of all, there is no global consensus of how to regulate Airbnb. In some places, we have a night cap, which is a maximum in the number of nights that you can rent Airbnb. In some places, we are gonna put a tax on the price of Airbnb. And this is very important because if we wanna target different types of Airbnb hosts, such as this commercial host or professional Airbnbs, we should know how to design this policy. And I want to also pose a question out there that is not only how to target different types of hosts, but also the distributional implications of different policies. And I will encourage the authors to have a little bit of a distributional discussion in their paper, because of course it's not going to be the same if we target the occasional host, which wants to make some extra money, than if we target the professional host. And then just to finalize, what I want to say is that given the very good data that they have, because they have very good data on rents, which is very rare for the US at least, the question that I want to that I want to pose is that, can we disentangle the Airbnb has many effects on rental prices? The first one is the option value coming from the efficiency gains. The second one is the supply effect. I'm removing housing stock away from the long-term rental market, so this is going to have an effect on prices. And there is also the externality effect. externality effect, which is is Airbnb changing neighborhoods? So I would also encourage authors, with the great data set that they have, if they are able to disentangle all of these three effects. And that's everything that I have to say for this paper. And I enjoyed reading it, and I really enjoyed the data. So I'm looking forward to seeing the next steps.
Great. Thank you very much for the great discussion. Tomaso, I don't know if you want to take a few minutes to discuss to give your reaction, or to open up the floor to questions.
Well, maybe one point on identification, because I mean, we really fought a lot. And so while it's true that you have this trend, so the idea of really focusing on a short window, right, around this major change, because for Airbnb, that was really a huge change. So for the availability of Airbnb, so it's a drop up to 30%, right? So we think that allow us to identify the effect of Airbnb. We thought also about different design using kind of diff and diff, looking at areas with high Airbnb intensity and others. So I know the work of you were mentioning, because they are colleagues at the DIW. So Klaus also has another paper on another rental regulation and so on, using diff and diff. Diff and diff is possible. Post-sum is a possibility, but these are very different markets, right? So as much as I like diff and diff, I find so the choice that we made in this paper more convincing. But it's true that actually it would be relatively easy, probably, for us to have at least a robustness check using post-sum as a control. And the other thing, yeah, I mean, these are great suggestions, and I mean, this project could go on, and looking at many of these aspects, the long-term housing market. So we try to get transaction values on house prices, and then think about these redistribution effects, which are extremely important, I think. And in this version of the paper, we talk really very little about that. I think we should put much more, because the aim of this regulation is exactly what you were mentioning, right? So you don't want to punish people who want to efficiently share for some time the apartment and make maybe some little money on the side. But then you have all the discussion about taxes. Should they pay taxes? How do they pay taxes? So there are many other questions, and maybe we should discuss at some point whether there is something more that one can do.
Great, thank you. So now feel free to unmute yourself and ask some questions if you would like to do that. We have time for that.
Hey, it's Steve here. I don't know, could you hear me?
Yes, hi Steve.
Hi Tomaso, ¿cómo está? So one thing I'm curious about the regulation. I mean, I think it's a clever way to identify what's going on. But if I put on my Chicago hat, which I don't wear all the time, you know, part of this is just a supply and demand story. And we know that these cities have significant regulations on expansion, on zoning, on building. If those regulations are relaxed, one might expect developers to find these higher rents attractive to build, or investors, which would obviously create pressure in the other direction. So could this be, I mean, of course, within the environment, the finger is pointed at Airbnb. The question, one takes a step back, should the finger be pointed at regulation that restricts supply?
Yeah, I mean, so when I saw the first light of Milena, I was thinking, so I moved to Berlin in '96, right? So I tried to go away a couple of times, I always came back. So I observed this city and the market for many years. And you are completely right. So Berlin is an extremely regulated city, especially when it comes to rent. I mean, to a point that is almost crazy. Now we have a cap on rent that is ridiculous, right? So, and it's exacerbating all these problems of a supply that is not able to meet the exploding demand, right? So I do think that all these things play a much bigger role. And again, so our colleagues here at the DIW are really looking at many things. So Klaus is one of these, and has written several papers on these other regulations showing that actually the impact is much larger. Therefore, also in the policy discussion, when we went out with this piece, we said, hey, look, Airbnb does have an effect. We have now some clear facts and try to think about identification, but this is small, right? So we have 2 million apartment in Berlin, right? So Airbnb is 10,000, right? So no, sorry, yeah, so 20,000 it is more. So if one wants to solve this problem of exploding rent, then other instruments are surely much more important, right? So, but Airbnb, you know, I mean, a city like Berlin, so people love to shoot against the bad American company that is coming and destroying the rental market, which is not what is happening.
I have a question, if there's no one jumping in. Oh, I see somebody's hands raised. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and ask a question, I think. Then I'll.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask because I was thinking that the long-term rental market, I guess that prices adjust slowly, in the sense that I guess, I don't know how does it work in Berlin, but for example, in Spain, contracts in the long-term rental market are 5-year duration. So it is only when your contract ends, or I mean, like it could take some delay for the market price in the long rental market to adapt to changes in the Airbnb market. What do you think about that?
That's true, and that is also one of the other reasons why I like this identification strategy, right? So so we don't use a different diff. So sure, we use a variation that is induced by this regulation that induce a change in the number of Airbnb. But essentially, we look at the correlation between the number of Airbnbs and the rent, right? So, and we find this strong effect, right? So now I was also surprised when we ran this regression on rentals and to find this one-to-one reaction that is almost immediate, right? So, but that is what we find, right? So, yeah, it's a good question. So actually, in Berlin, it's even worse than in Spain. So I couldn't believe when I came here. So you rent an apartment and essentially it's forever. They cannot kick you out anymore for the rest of your life unless the owner can prove that they have the right to use this apartment from themselves, right? So, so going back to Steve's question about the regulation of the market, right? So, but again, so I think one could think much more about this. So we took this very hands-on approach and said, so let's see what the data is telling us using this identification strategy that we find very plausible, and this is the results that we observe, right? So clearly, I mean, what is interesting is to think the long-term effects on the overall housing market. So who is buying and selling, right? So, but again, so Airbnb doesn't play a big role. I own an apartment in Berlin, and now also they cap the rent, right? So I'm also renting an apartment, and from one day to the other, I pay 500 euros less rent because they cap the rent, right? So, so these are the big things, right? Is not maybe Airbnb.
And Tomaso, maybe we have time for. We have 1 minute left, and Alon, I see, has his hand up, and then, but real quickly, since we're probably going to run out of time before the end of that question, I just wanted to tell everybody thanks for coming, and feel free to stay on after the seminar ends. And otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you next week. And we will quickly give a round of applause to Tomaso, and then we hear Alon's question for those of us that want to stay. Thank you.